Then there are a lot of things in our modern lifestyle that makes it more difficult to absorb and utilize. But then when you look at different food tables, it doesn't look like it would be that difficult to get a few hundred milligrams of magnesium. Too often we get a one-sided message as if only plants had nutrients, and nothing could be further from the truth. Animal products are the most complete in nutrients, and when it comes to magnesium, they're actually pretty good sources. Hello health champions! Today we're going to talk about the top 10 foods that are high in magnesium. And you really want to watch this video carefully, because not only is magnesium critically important, it serves so many different functions, but it's also very difficult to absorb, and most people are deficient. Not only that, but I learned some very surprising things as I researched this in terms of which foods will actually be the best sources of magnesium. So magnesium is a mineral that acts as a cofactor, as a catalyst in over 300 enzymatic reactions. And there are so many different types of reactions, such as building things, the synthesis of proteins and DNA. It's involved in energy production. It's involved in muscle function and in nerve conduction. So the heart, of course, depends on both muscles and nerve signals. It is a component of bone, so it's involved in building the tissue, but also in the regulation of the buildup and breakdown of bone. It is critical for mental health and mood regulation, and also involved in glucose and insulin regulation. So it's involved in metabolic functions as well. So there's hardly anything that happens in the body where magnesium doesn't play a part. And the recommended daily intake for men is about 400 to 420 milligrams. And for women, it's about 310 to 320. But then there are a lot of things in our modern lifestyle that makes it more difficult to absorb and utilize. And just a few of those would be things like stress and caffeine and preservatives and all kinds of different chemicals. Medications can affect it, and as we age, we don't absorb it as effectively. And then, of course, if you have any sort of gastrointestinal issue, which so many people have today. So because all these different factors can make it more difficult to utilize magnesium, most people who work in the functional medicine field, who do blood work and actually monitor these things, they suggest that we need probably between 500 and 600 milligrams a day. But then when you look at different food tables, it doesn't look like it would be that difficult to get a few hundred milligrams of magnesium. But here's where we need to start understanding this a little more carefully. You can't just look at a typical table and say that, oh, well, look, milk has 24 milligrams, salmon has 25, and you go down the list, chicken has 30, spinach has 79, oats have 125, Brazil nuts 376, and hemp is the superstar at 700 milligrams. Because there are two critical factors that we need to understand in terms of how much we're actually ingesting and how much we are absorbing and utilizing. And the first one is serving size. And I'm going to start the list here, and on my top 10 list, we're going to count down, and we'll start with number 11 because I couldn't limit it to 10. So we're going to have 11 in this list. So some examples would be romaine lettuce, kale, arugula, spinach, and Swiss chard, for example. And romaine doesn't have a whole lot to start with. It has 15 milligrams of magnesium per 100 grams of lettuce. Kale has a little more at 33, arugula has 47, spinach has 79, and Swiss chard has 81. So it looks like substantial amounts here, but remember, this is per 100 grams. And how much leafy greens can you really eat? A typical serving size of 2 cups of chopped or shredded leafy greens are about 30 grams. It's very difficult to eat 100 grams of leafy greens. So now when we look at how much you're getting per serving, we see that romaine lettuce would give you 5 milligrams, kale has 10, arugula 14, and then spinach and Swiss chard would do 24 each. And the other important critical factor is called anti-nutrients. So everything that's alive wants to defend itself against getting eaten. And a lot of animals will have claws and fangs and teeth, or they run really fast. But plants have none of these. So therefore, they defend themselves with chemicals. And these chemicals are slightly toxic, so they discourage other animals from eating the plants. And the two primary factors that are involved with magnesium are called oxalates and phytates. And these are not like super dangerous to most people. We can have different levels of sensitivities. If you have a tendency to kidney stones, then you probably really want to avoid oxalates. If you have sensitivities to all sorts of things, then either one of these might cause reactions. But for most people, it's important because it reduces the availability of the nutrients that we eat. So depending on the plant and depending on how you cook them, the phytates and oxalates could reduce magnesium availability by 25 to 60%. So if we go back to the table with leafy greens, and now we take into account the anti-nutrients, now we see that for romaine, kale, and arugula, it probably reduces the absorption by about 25%. And these are very rough, round numbers because it's not like they've done very detailed studies on every single plant out there. But we do know that spinach and Swiss chard have a lot more oxalates, so therefore it is probably somewhere around a 50% reduction. So now when we go back and look at the numbers of what's probably available, now we see that there's even less here. So we see 3 milligrams, 7 milligrams, 11, and 12. And of course, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't eat leafy greens. It means you should eat a variety of different foods, but leafy greens are not going to be your main source of magnesium. However, every little bit counts. And next we have fruits and berries, and a few examples would be blackberries, raspberries, banana, and avocado. When we look at how much is in there per 100 grams, we see blackberries have 20, raspberries have 22 milligrams, banana has 27, avocado has 29. Now, even though avocado is usually talked about as a vegetable, it is technically a fruit. And the reason I included it here is that in terms of anti-nutrients, it is more like a fruit and a berry. And we have a negligible amount, so it's pretty much zero. It might be a tiny, tiny amount, but for all practical purposes, there are 0 anti-nutrients in fruits. Because fruits are a little different, they typically want to get eaten because then the animals will spread the seeds all over the place, and that's part of how the blackberries and the fruits can spread themselves. And a typical serving size of fruits and berries would be 100 grams. And now, of course, because there are no anti-nutrients, we actually get that number in terms of how much we can utilize. And the thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you are insulin resistant, if you're trying to lose weight, then the blackberries and raspberries, you probably can eat up to 100 grams because they only have about 5 grams of net carbs in them. A banana is going to have much, much more than that. And it's also a starchy food. So if you're trying to lose weight, you probably want to favor the berries over the banana. And the avocado, on the other hand, is extremely low in carbohydrate. It's a fantastic food, and you could eat even a whole lot more than 100 grams. There's really no limit to the avocado. Number 9 is non-starchy vegetables, and I talk a lot about those because they're very nutritious and they fit very well on a low carbohydrate diet. So if you just eat protein from animals like steak or eggs, then these will supplement the meals very, very well. You can eat a lot of these without getting a bunch of starch or carbohydrates. So we have Brussels sprouts, beets, we have green beans, cauliflower, and broccoli as examples of really good non-starchy vegetables. And Brussels sprouts have about 23 milligrams. Beets have the same, green beans 25, cauliflower 15, and broccoli 21 milligrams per 100 grams of food. And when it comes to anti-nutrients, these are pretty favorable as far as plants are concerned. They're very low levels, so somewhere around 10% anti-nutrients, or the anti-nutrients would reduce the magnesium utilization by about 10%. And again, these are rough numbers. It's going to vary, depend on the food and on the person. And of course, everyone's going to have different habits in terms of how much they eat, but I put down roughly what I think I would eat. So for the first 3, I would probably eat about 100 grams. And for the cauliflower and broccoli, though, I might eat 200 grams or even more. So now the net values that we actually absorb would be 21 from the Brussels sprouts, 21 from beets, 23 from green beans, 27 from cauliflower, and 38 from broccoli. Number 8 is dairy, and this is something that most people would never promote as a good magnesium food. So take a look at this. We have cheese and milk, and this pretty much covers all sorts of dairy, because it's either going to be a concentrated form like cheese, or it's going to be some derivation of milk or yogurt, which has about the same protein, fat, and water content in it. So cheese has about 28 grams per 100, and milk and yogurt would have about 24. And of course, because it is an animal food, it has 0 anti-nutrients. There's no chemicals that prevent the utilization. But in terms of how much we consume, I would assume that most people probably have about 30 grams or an ounce of cheese. So that puts the utilizable, the per serving, absorbable for cheese at about 8 grams, which is not a whole lot. But for milk, it might be as high as 48. And this is for having 200 grams, which is a little bit less than a cup. Number 7 is whole grain. And here we have whole wheat bread, we have brown rice, we have oats, and we have buckwheat. And I'm not a fan of grains, and I'm including these here, not because I'm suggesting you should eat them, but more as a reference because they're brought up so often as having high magnesium. So per 100 grams, wheat bread, not the flour itself, but by the time you bake bread from it, would have about 76 milligrams of magnesium per 100 grams of bread. Brown rice cooked would have about 25. Oats, the dry before we cook them, would have about 125. And buckwheat cooked would have about 51. The anti-nutrients are going to be between 20 and 50, so I just picked the mid-range there at 35, which means in terms of how much we actually use, the serving size would be maybe 30 for wheat bread, because that's 1 slice, and I don't recommend that we eat a whole lot of bread. I know the main guidelines talk about eating most of your calories as starch, but we're finding out more and more how unhealthy that is, and especially the wheat, because of the way it's processed, the way it's produced with glyphosate and gluten and allergies. I would suggest that you stay away from wheat, but if you eat it once in a while, then don't have a whole lot. So limit yourself to a slice probably. And that would give you about 15 milligrams of magnesium. Brown rice would be about half a cup of cooked rice would be 20. And then oats, when you cook a serving, it's about 45 grams of dry oats, or about 1.5 ounces. And that makes a cup of oatmeal, and that has 37 milligrams of magnesium. And buckwheat is probably the best one out of these. It's not really a grain, it's a pseudograin or a seed. And 1/2 cup of cooked buckwheat would have 40 milligrams of magnesium. And now here's some really good news for people who love chocolate, because that's a great source of magnesium. There is cocoa powder and there is dark chocolate. I don't recommend the milk chocolate in any shape or form because the vast majority of that is sugar. There's very, very little cocoa in it, and the cocoa is what has the magnesium. So cocoa powder has 500 milligrams per 100 grams of powder, and dark chocolate would have about 228. It does have some anti-nutrients, so you're probably going to reduce the availability by about 25%. And then, of course, we have to look at the serving size. So 1 tablespoon of cocoa powder, assuming that you make a cup of hot chocolate with 1 tablespoon, would be about 6 grams, which would give you about 23 milligrams of magnesium. And if you have about 1/3 of a chocolate bar, that would be about 30 grams of dark chocolate. That would give you 51 milligrams. So it's a nice little snack. And if you eat something like 85% dark chocolate, that means there's roughly 15% sugar in there. So you can have 30 grams of dark chocolate and only get a few grams of sugar with that, but still get quite a bit of nutrients. Number 5 is legumes. And here we have things like lentils and black beans and chickpeas. And per 100 grams of food, we have 36 milligrams in lentils, we have 70 in black beans, and 115 in chickpeas. Now, unfortunately, beans have a lot of anti-nutrients, so up to 50% of the magnesium would not be available. Now, one thing we want to keep in mind is that if we soak and cook the food, then we can reduce the anti-nutrients, so more of the magnesium becomes available. Now, things like lettuce and arugula, obviously you don't really want to cook. Spinach, you could cook a little bit, but things like beans lends themselves really well to cooking, and especially if you pressure cook them, now you can get the temperature up higher than 100 degrees Celsius or 212 Fahrenheit due to the pressure, and now you would neutralize more of those anti-nutrients. And then you would get the magnesium availability close to these numbers. So if we assume a serving size of 120, then lentils would give us 22, black beans would give us 42, and chickpeas 69. But again, if you cook them, especially pressure cook, then these numbers could be higher. Number 4 is fish. And now we're getting into some food that isn't just plant-based. I'm a huge fan of a varied diet. I think we are omnivores, but too often we hear that we should eat nutritious food like plants. And nothing against plants, but too often we get a one-sided message as if only plants had nutrients, and nothing could be further from the truth. Animal products are the most complete in nutrients, and when it comes to magnesium, they're actually pretty good sources. So let's look at salmon, sardines, halibut, and mackerel, where salmon has 25 milligrams per 100 grams, sardines has 40, halibut 27, and mackerel 60. But keep in mind, these are not plants, so there are no anti-nutrients involved, and the serving size is going to depend on you. I put down roughly what I would eat in a normal serving, and I'm assuming I would eat about 150 grams of each, except sardines. I would probably eat a can, which comes in at about 100. So now with salmon, we would get 38. With sardines, we get 40, halibut 41, and mackerel 90 milligrams. Category number 3 is nuts. And here we're including walnuts, almonds, cashews, and Brazil nuts. And now we're getting to some food that is very, very high in magnesium. So we have walnuts at 158, almonds at 270, cashews at 292, and Brazil nuts at 376. And the anti-nutrients are considerable. They're at 35, so you're probably losing about 1/3 of that. And nuts are probably not something that you're going to eat by the cup. I'm assuming the average serving size is about 1 ounce or 30 grams, which would be a typical snack size. And now walnuts would give you 31 milligrams, almonds 53, cashews 57, and Brazil nuts 73. And the only thing that I would point out about these is that generally my favorite nuts are walnuts, pecans, and macadamia, because I'm looking more in terms of carbohydrates and the quality of the fat and the tendency toward allergies. So unfortunately here, almonds and Brazil nuts have quite a high tendency toward allergies. So when people go low carb, very often they start loading up on almonds because it's in everything. You can buy almond flour and there's products made of almonds. But when you start eating something a lot, then your body tends to develop a sensitivity to it. So I think these are good foods, but keep in mind that if you eat a lot of almonds and especially a lot of Brazil nuts, you might develop some sensitivities and some inflammation. So everything there in moderation. And cashews are one of the highest in carbohydrates, so don't go crazy on that one either. Category number 2 is meat. And here we're looking at beef, lamb, and chicken because there's not really much difference between them. So anything similar to these would probably have similar numbers. Beef is listed at 25, lamb at 26, and chicken at 30. So it would probably depend on if you have a lean chicken or if you eat the wings or the thigh, because the magnesium is probably mostly going to be in the meat and more than the fat. Because these are animal products, there are no anti-nutrients. So now we have to look at how much would we probably eat of this. And again, I put the numbers that I would probably eat. So if I have a steak, I'm probably going to have at least 8 ounces or 200 grams, maybe 12 or even 16 if I'm having a nice ribeye. If I'm having chicken, probably a little less. If I had lamb, somewhere in between. But at 200 grams, we would get 50 milligrams of magnesium available, lamb 52, and chicken 60. So I hope you can see that there's not a single superfood that you can just eat some of this and it's going to provide everything. This just underscores the importance of eating a variety of different foods every day. But here is the key point of what you don't want to eat. So SAD is the standard American diet, and unfortunately most of the world is following suit. So a huge percentage of the food people eat comes from sugar, from white flour, and from seed oil. So what these have in common is they're completely devoid of nutrients. They have carbohydrate and or fat, and a little bit of protein in the white flour. But basically you're getting nothing from these foods, and yet they make up the majority of what most people eat. And the US has been the worst, but like I said, the rest of the world is catching up, which we can see in the rising rates of diabetes around the world. And just to illustrate my point here, sugar has 0 milligrams of magnesium. White flour would have 3 grams, not per slice, but per 100 gram of flour. And seed oil, again, would have 0. And then we look at the anti-nutrients, and I don't know if there's any anti-nutrients in sugar or seed oil, but since we're at 0 anyway, it doesn't affect it that much. With flour, we're at 35%, so we're getting 0 from sugar. We might get 2 milligrams from 100 grams of bread. So per slice, we're getting less than 1 milligram. With seed oils, we're getting nothing. So right here is the single biggest reason that we are so magnesium deficient, that we're eating the majority of our food from things that have no nutrients. And that's why it's so critical that we start eating real food and we start eating the best and the greatest variety of real food that we can find. And the number one category of food to give you magnesium is seeds. And we have things like chia, flax, pumpkin, sunflower, and hemp. And they're all very high in magnesium. So chia would give you 335 milligrams per 100 grams of seed, flax 392, pumpkin 262, sunflower would be at 325, and hemp would be at 700. And the magnesium content is very high, but they do have some anti-nutrients, so we need to take about 35% off of these numbers. And then we also take into account the serving size. And here, if you do it differently, you figure out numbers for you. I'm going to assume that I would eat about 20 grams of chia, flax, or hemp, and I might eat a little more of pumpkin seed or sunflower seed. So the available amount in chia would be 44 milligrams per serving, flax would be 51, pumpkin would be 51, sunflower seeds would be 63, and hemp would be 91 milligrams per serving. And here I want to share something that I do quite a bit that gives you a really good amount of magnesium. So I make my own yogurt, so it gets really nice and tart. It has very little sugar left, but very high bacterial content, lots of probiotics. And then I put about half a serving of chia, half hemp, and half of pumpkin seeds. So I would get about, instead of 20 grams, I would get about 10, which is like 1 tablespoon of each of these. And now we're actually getting about 48 milligrams from the yogurt. We're getting 22 from the chia, 45 from the hemp, and 25 from the pumpkin. So in one serving, which is not a huge meal, you're actually getting 140 milligrams of available magnesium, or about 1/3 of your daily allowance. So that's just one way that you can incorporate and get a good chunk of magnesium. And now I'm really happy to announce that I'm ready to expand the telehealth services from my clinic. It's a brand new program called Nexus Body Testing, which will include comprehensive testing, lab testing, and consultations. And it will make it possible for you to become a client without having to travel. If you're interested in learning more, there's a link down below. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.